The sun hung low in the sky, casting a dim, orange glow over the quiet neighborhood. Nathan sat on the porch, gazing out at the empty street. His thoughts wandered, as they often did these days, drawn to the one person who seemed to understand him better than anyone else, Luke. There had always been something magnetic about Luke. They had been inseparable since childhood, sharing a bond forged through years of shared secrets, laughter, and even pain. But lately, the closeness between them had taken on a different hue. It wasn't just friendship anymore, and Nathan wasn't sure if he was ready to admit it. At 18, Nathan's life should have been about the future, college, dreams, a clear path ahead. But instead, it felt like he was stuck, treading water in the confusion of his feelings. His father had raised him to be tough, to uphold certain ideals of masculinity. But those ideals seemed more like shackles than guiding principles. He often found himself at odds with the person he was supposed to be and the person he was becoming. And Luke, with his laid-back charm and effortless confidence, had become the one person who made Nathan feel seen, without judgment. It was in their moments of quiet togetherness that Nathan began to realize just how much Luke meant to him. More than a best friend, more than anything he could easily define. Their friendship had always been easy, natural. From late-night talks about their dreams to shared laughter over inside jokes, they had created a world of their own. Luke was the one person Nathan could always rely on, the one who had never let him down. But recently, there had been small moments, an accidental touch when they passed each other, lingering gazes when they thought the other wasn't looking, that hinted at something more, something Nathan didn't have the courage to name. He didn't want to ruin what they had, but the line between friendship and something deeper was beginning to blur in ways that unsettled him. It was a Sunday afternoon when it happened. Nathan's father was away on one of his frequent business trips, leaving the house unusually quiet. Luke had come over to hang out, as he often did, but today the air between them felt heavier, charged with an unspoken tension. They had always been comfortable in each other's presence, but today was different. As they sat on the couch, Luke shifted slightly, his knee brushing against Nathan's. It was a small thing, but it sent a jolt of heat through Nathan's chest. He tried to ignore it, pretending to be absorbed in the TV show they were watching. But the moment lingered, making his pulse race. "Hey," Luke said, breaking the silence, his voice softer than usual. "You okay? You seem distant." Nathan nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just tired, I guess." Luke didn't buy it. He turned to face Nathan, his expression serious. "You sure? You've been acting weird lately. It's like something's on your mind." Nathan wanted to say something, anything, to explain the feelings swirling inside him, but the words caught in his throat. How could he explain the way his heart raced when Luke was near, or the way his stomach fluttered when their hands brushed by accident? He couldn't. It was too much to admit, even to himself. "I'm fine, really," Nathan finally managed, hoping his voice didn't betray him. But Luke didn't seem convinced. He studied Nathan for a moment, his eyes narrowing with an intensity that made Nathan uncomfortable. It wasn't the first time Luke had looked at him like this, intently, as though trying to read something that Nathan wasn't ready to reveal. It was as if Luke knew, on some level, that the boundaries between them had started to shift too. And yet, he said nothing. They both sat in silence, the unspoken understanding hanging between them, unaddressed. As the evening wore on, the tension grew. They found themselves alone in the house, the air thick with the weight of unspoken words. Nathan was acutely aware of every glance, every movement Luke made. The familiar rhythm of their interactions felt distorted, as though a new layer of complexity had been added without either of them fully acknowledging it. At one point, Luke excused himself to the bathroom, and Nathan sat in the living room, trying to steady his thoughts. His mind was a whirlwind. He had never felt so confused in his life. What was happening? Why was this friendship suddenly feeling so much more complicated? He didn't know how to navigate the emotions rising within him, and he certainly didn't know how to deal with the growing attraction he felt for Luke. It was terrifying, the idea of losing their friendship, yet thrilling in a way that made his head spin. As Nathan sat lost in thought, he heard the sound of the bathroom door opening. He looked up, only to find Luke standing in the hallway, leaning against the doorframe with a hesitant look on his face. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. There was something different in Luke's eyes, a quiet intensity, a rawness that Nathan hadn't noticed before. "I need to tell you something," Luke said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but found he couldn't form words. The air between them was thick with anticipation. For a moment, everything seemed to hold its breath. Luke took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "I don't know what's going on with us, Nathan, but I can't ignore it anymore. I feel something more. Do you?" The question hung in the air, and Nathan's world tilted on its axis. The truth that had been buried deep inside him for so long suddenly felt too real to deny. Luke's confession mirrored everything Nathan had been feeling, and for a split second, he wondered if this moment had been inevitable all along. But before Nathan could respond, the front door creaked open, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the house. It was his father, home earlier than expected. Nathan's heart sank. The tension between him and Luke was shattered in an instant, replaced by a sudden rush of anxiety. He didn't know what this moment meant, what it would mean for him and Luke. But as his father's voice called out from the hallway, Nathan realized that everything was about to change. Nathan froze as his father stepped into the living room, his eyes narrowing with that familiar, disapproving look. The air in the room thickened, as though the very walls were holding their breath. It had been a while since Nathan had seen his father look at him like this, his expression a mixture of confusion, anger, and disappointment. And all it took was that one glance for Nathan to feel the weight of 1,000 unspoken rules he had never managed to meet. Luke shifted uncomfortably beside him, visibly tense, his own gaze flickering from Nathan to the doorway. The atmosphere had changed in an instant. Gone were the moments of shared vulnerability, the unspoken confessions. They were replaced now by the suffocating reality of Nathan's father's presence. "Who's this?" his father asked sharply, his voice laced with a familiar edge of judgment. Nathan opened his mouth, but nothing came out. It was as though the words had frozen in his throat, caught between the truth he wasn't ready to confront and the lies he'd been telling himself. His father's glare cut through the silence. Nathan knew he had to say something, anything, but his mind was a blur. The words he should have said, "It's Luke, my best friend," stuck behind a dam of guilt that he couldn't break. We were just hanging out," Nathan managed finally, though the words sounded hollow even to him. It wasn't the full truth. It wasn't even a half-truth. But it was the best he could muster, the only thing his brain allowed him to say. Luke stood up abruptly, his movements stiff. "I should go," he muttered, his voice strained. His face was flushed, and his eyes seemed to avoid meeting Nathan's. It was as if the air had been sucked from the room, and he couldn't breathe. Nathan watched, helpless, as Luke turned and headed toward the door, the moments slipping through their fingers like sand. But just as Luke reached for the doorknob, his father's voice sliced through the thick silence. "No one's leaving until I understand what the hell is going on here." The words hung in the air, suffocating and sharp. Nathan felt like he had been thrust into a pit of confusion. His pulse raced, and his heart pounded in his chest as his father's figure loomed large in the doorway, blocking any exit. He had been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, his life suddenly unraveling in ways he never could have predicted. Luke hesitated, standing at the threshold of the door, his hand frozen on the knob. Nathan could see the conflict on his face, the same conflict that mirrored his own. Luke didn't want to be caught in this mess, didn't want to be the one who triggered whatever this was between Nathan and his father. But he had already crossed a line, and so had Nathan. Nathan stood, his legs unsteady, as if his body had forgotten how to move. He turned toward his father, hoping to find some semblance of strength in himself. "Dad, it's not what you think," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His father raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "Then what is it, Nathan? Because from where I'm standing, this looks like something that shouldn't be happening." The words hit harder than Nathan had expected. His father's disapproval stung, but it was something deeper, an accusation that cut to the very core of Nathan's identity. He was standing on the precipice of something he didn't fully understand himself. Yet here his father was, demanding answers. Luke, still standing in the doorway, cleared his throat. "I think I should go," he said again, quieter this time, his voice tinged with discomfort. He looked at Nathan, a fleeting expression of regret crossing his face before he turned to leave. But before Nathan could say anything to stop him, his father's voice cut in once more. "No, Luke, you're not going anywhere yet." The finality in his father's tone left no room for argument. "Both of you are going to explain what's going on here." The tension in the room was unbearable. Nathan could hear his own breath, shallow and fast, as the walls seemed to close in around him. His father's gaze never wavered, his eyes full of anger and something else, something deeper. Nathan couldn't quite place it, but it felt like betrayal. His father had always been the pillar of his life, the steady presence that set the rules. But now, with that same gaze burning into him, Nathan wasn't sure if he even knew who his father was anymore. I don't know what to say," Nathan whispered, his voice trembling. "It wasn't planned. We didn't—" "Stop lying to me, Nathan," his father interrupted, his voice cold. "I'm not stupid. I can see what's going on here." Nathan's chest tightened. He could feel the walls closing in on him, the crushing weight of everything he had tried to hide. He couldn't lie anymore, couldn't pretend that what had happened between him and Luke was just some accident. It wasn't, and there was no going back now. Luke shifted uncomfortably beside him. "I don't know what you think happened," Luke began, his voice low, "but I don't want to make things worse." Nathan's father turned to Luke, his expression hardening. You're part of this too. You think you can just waltz in here and whatever happens, happens? You think you can just mess around with my son and I won't notice?" The accusation in his father's voice hit Nathan like a slap. The guilt, the shame, the confusion, it all welled up inside him, bubbling to the surface. He wanted to yell, to argue that they hadn't done anything wrong, that they were just two people who were trying to understand something neither of them had the words for. But how could he defend that when he himself wasn't sure? Luke glanced at Nathan, his face torn. "I didn't mean for this to happen. But I feel something for him, and I think he feels the same way. It's not easy to explain, but it's not something we planned. It just happened." The words hung in the air, pregnant with meaning. For a moment, everything stood still. Nathan's father was silent, his expression unreadable. And for the first time, Nathan realized that he wasn't sure what would happen next. What would his father say? Would he even understand? But before anyone could speak, Nathan felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He didn't know what was happening, what had happened, but for the first time it felt like the truth was out in the open, raw and untamed. And in that moment, as the weight of his father's silence pressed down on him, Nathan knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The silence in the house was suffocating, hanging thick in the air long after Nathan's father had stormed off to his bedroom. Nathan sat in the living room, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on his knees. Luke, still standing by the door, hadn't moved. Neither of them knew what to say. What could be said in the wake of everything that had just come crashing down? Nathan's mind was a mess. His father's anger still echoed in his ears. But underneath it was something far worse, the deep, unspoken disappointment. Nathan had always tried to be the son his father wanted, following the rules, keeping his distance from anything that might tarnish the image of strength his father had cultivated for him. But in one moment, everything had unraveled. And now, his father knew the truth. It wasn't just a lie about who Nathan was spending his time with. It was about Nathan himself. And there was no escaping that truth now. Luke cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Nathan, I'm sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." Nathan looked up at him, his heart pounding in his chest. The words seemed to stick in his throat, the confusion and guilt swirling inside him too strong to speak. He wanted to tell Luke that it wasn't his fault, that they were both just trying to navigate something they didn't fully understand. But the words felt hollow, like an excuse he didn't believe. Because, deep down, he knew the truth. It wasn't just about their confusion. It was about their choices. "You didn't do anything wrong," Nathan finally whispered, his voice barely audible. I don't know what to do. My dad, I think he's never going to look at me the same way again." Luke nodded slowly, his gaze softening as he crossed the room and sat down beside Nathan. He didn't say anything, but the way he looked at Nathan, gently, without judgment, made Nathan feel like maybe, just maybe, things weren't completely lost. I don't know what's happening between us, Nathan continued, his voice breaking slightly. I never meant for any of this. I never meant to hurt anyone. Luke's hand hesitated for a moment before it rested gently on Nathan's, a silent reassurance. Nathan didn't pull away. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he didn't feel like he was drowning in shame. Luke's touch was grounding, and as their fingers brushed, it was like a lifeline in the middle of a storm. Nathan, Luke said softly, his voice steady, you haven't hurt anyone. We're just figuring this out. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. But Nathan could feel the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him. He couldn't ignore the guilt that surged within him every time he thought of his father's face, disappointed, angry, hurt. It wasn't just about the moment they were caught in. It was everything that had led up to it. Their secret, their growing feelings. It had all been building towards something inevitable. But Nathan hadn't been ready to face it. And now, neither was his father. I don't even know if he'll forgive me, Nathan whispered, his eyes cast downward. And even if he does, what happens next? What does this mean for me? For us? Luke's gaze softened, and he took a deep breath. I don't know, Nathan. I don't have the answers. But we don't have to figure it all out right now. We can take it one step at a time. Nathan nodded slowly, but the uncertainty still gnawed at him. He wished things could be simpler, that they could go back to the way they had been before, when the only thing that mattered was the comfort of their friendship. But nothing would be the same after today. Not with his father, and not with Luke. The feelings between them had changed. They had both crossed a line, and there was no way to go back to the way things were. Luke squeezed his hand, a silent promise of support. Nathan looked at him, and for the first time since everything had unraveled, he didn't feel alone. They didn't need to have all the answers. But they needed each other, and maybe that was enough for now. I don't want to lose you, Luke, Nathan said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what this means, but I don't want to lose you. Luke met his gaze, his eyes filled with an understanding that cut deeper than any words could express. You won't lose me, he said firmly. Whatever happens with your dad, I'll be here. We'll figure this out together. The sincerity in Luke's words was all Nathan needed to hear. The truth was, nothing was certain. His relationship with his father was forever changed, and there was no undoing what had been done. But with Luke by his side, Nathan felt like he might just be able to navigate the chaos, piece by piece. After a long moment of silence, Luke stood and stretched, glancing over at Nathan. I think you should talk to your dad, he said quietly. I know it's scary, but you don't want to leave things like this. Nathan nodded. It wasn't going to be easy, and he didn't know how his father would react. But the conversation was inevitable. He couldn't keep running from the truth. Not anymore. I'll talk to him, Nathan said, though his voice wavered. He wasn't sure what would happen after the conversation, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was beginning to take control of his life again. Luke gave him a small, encouraging smile. I'm proud of you, Nathan. You're stronger than you think. Nathan watched as Luke walked toward the door, his presence in the room a calming influence even as he left. As the door closed behind him, Nathan sat in the quiet, taking a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of resolve settle over him. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know how his father would react, or how things would unfold between him and Luke. But for the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't drowning in guilt or confusion. He was taking the first step towards something new, something uncertain but real. And whatever came next, he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't have to face it alone. As he stood up and made his way to his father's room, Nathan felt a small flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start.